Because I traveled so much around the world, I became an amateur art collector. These are from Nepal and Tibet. My first trip, I think, was to Germany, where we began to borrow Deutschmark directly from some of the Eurocentrale and cooperative banks in Germany. Well, when I entered the bank in 1968, Robert McNamara had just recently become the president of the bank, and he wanted to lend much more money than the bank had been lending. The fact is that the bank in 1968 only had about $3.5 billion of outstanding debt. And since for the most part, bank lending is a function of how much it can borrow, it had borrowed very little and therefore lent very little in the previous 20 years of its existence. The first obstacle was the attitude of countries, that is member countries, toward the bank. And countries said, we can't afford to export our capital, which you're going to take, and then lend to other countries. Our savings are constrained, we won't let you do it. Second, there were insufficient long-term bond markets in the world because most countries did not have an insurance industry, a pension industry, which needed and could use long-term bonds. So that was unavailable to us. The second concern was the attitude of investors. Even assuming we had permission to borrow, we hadn't borrowed, for example, in the US for 10 years. And there were a whole range of reasons. First, the bank was going to lend to basically the poor. We could call them less developed countries, but people who have great wealth and who control great wealth, investors, for example, don't, for the most part, lend to institutions who lend to the poor. Here we are, late 1960s, early 1970s, subject to all these kinds of constraints, if you will, which were the reason why the bank hadn't borrowed and therefore lent very little in its first 20 years. And the first thing that happened is currencies began to float, which meant that the market would establish the currencies, that is, central banks could not control the level of the currency versus the US dollar. Even the industrialized countries realized that they had to borrow outside of their own savings base, outside of their own taxable savings base. The moment that began to happen, the World Bank said, we too are an intermediary and wish to borrow funds not for Australia or for Sweden, but for developing countries who need the funds. When I came to the bank, over 2 billion people were living in absolute poverty. Now it's down to 600 million. That's important. That meant there are a lot of children are born who would not have been born had the bank not existed. And one day, as I often have said, there'll be a little girl who's yet unborn from Bangladesh who will be the president of the World Bank. And she will not know it, but the people in the Treasurer's Department and places like the Treasurer's Department started a process of educating little girls in Bangladesh, which, although she'll never know their name, will result in good stuff will happen. This is given to me the day I left the bank. And you can see that it's a person who no longer exists. His hat, his coat, his cane is hanging up, but he's not there in that sculpture anymore. He's gone. But fortunately, he's still wearing a white hat.